Greetings, Earthlings and others. I'm Louis Mehl-Madrona, and I'm happy to be here. And I know there's invisible spirits out in Zoom land who are watching us at this moment. It's a little eerie. All right, so my bio was too long, so I volunteered to introduce myself. So by way of labels, I've trained in family medicine, so I'm one of those. And also I'm a psychiatrist. And for some really crazy reason, they made me a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. I have no idea how I got to be that, but I did. And so I currently work with the 5 tribes of Maine, the Indigenous people of Maine, with the Wabanaki Public Health and Wellness, and I'm a graduate student in philosophy at the University of Maine. So that's my other activity. And all right, that's enough about me. Let's see how it does. I don't think it's working. It's not working. Where do I point it? Da, 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 da. Maybe it's working in Zoom land. Yeah. It was working before everybody walked in. Maybe you spooked it. Well, anyway, while they figure this out, I'm going to talk to you about Indigenous perspectives on non-ordinary experiences. And just to give you a sense for this, I'm part Indigenous, I'm not sure which part, but, and part European. So I'm a hybrid person. And I've been hanging out in Indian country for a really long time. And once, I see. So it's transcribing what I say as we speak. Wow, I know, this is scary. Really? Anyway, I've been hanging out for a long time, and probably when I was about 18, I started writing down what elders told me and recording stories. And so I have a lot of stories and a lot of field notes, and so this talk is based on all of that accumulated life experience and notes and stories and all of that. Let's see if it's working. No. You're going to play with it?
Yeah, it's the wireless.
Yeah. So anyway, I want to tell you a little bit about how I fell into this. And I grew up in southeastern Kentucky. My grandparents were culturally, to some degree, intact Cherokee people. My mother was trying really hard not to be Indian, although when she found out that the census taker called us Mexicans, she decided it was better to be Indian than Mexican. So my apologies to Mexicans everywhere. So I think the crossroads for me happened when I got to Stanford Medical School. And I was privileged enough to get in because I was running the precursor to MRI, which we called a carbon-13 nuclear magnetic resonance spectrometer. And that got me into Stanford because I knew how to run it. And I was at a lecture in pharmacology, and the professor said, boys, life is a relentless progression toward death, disease, and decay. The physician's job is to slow the rate of decline. And that freaked me out, because that wasn't what my grandmother would have said. And so I ran across campus to the Stanford Indian Center, and Henrietta Blue Eyes was sitting at the desk. And I burst through the door, and I said, Henrietta, I need an elder. And she said, what tribe? And I said, Cherokee. And she had two names that she pulled out of this archaic artifact called a Rolodex. Anyone remember Rolodexes? And I was visiting one of them the next week. So how about that? It's working. This is how to find me if you would like to find me. And we have a mailing list if you'd like to be on it. And this is my favorite castle and my favorite wife. So, and I do want to thank ISPS for inviting me, and also the original people of this land. And last night I tried to figure out who they were, and that was really hard. And so I don't actually know who they were because they got killed off a long time ago, which is really sad. And apparently the Spanish were pretty mean. And, but anyway, I just want to acknowledge their existence and hope that there might be a descendant somewhere of these people. There are, good. Do you, what are they called? Can you tell me?
This region, I think it's pronounced
Nisendin people. Great. Well, you know more than Wikipedia or the University of California website. So, thank you. So, my disclosure is someday I might get a royalty check if people buy my books, but I'm not asking you to, and I'm not expecting you to. So, anyway, so the key, I think, to indigenous practice and thought is that all beings have ontological validity. So we start from there, that this mountain is a being in its own right. And if you've ever spent time out in the wilderness, you know that mountains walk around. Have you noticed that? So I was at a ceremony in the Columbia River Gorge, and we were just kind of hanging out, and we noticed that the mountains were walking around. They kept moving. And so we, this was with one of the local tribes in eastern Washington, and we said, hey, did you know those mountains walk around? And they said, yeah, they do that. Don't pay them any mind. He said, just don't set your directions by them. So mountains have ontological validity too. Nothing is imaginary. Everything is real. This is the backbone of indigenous thought. So the water spirit is real. The sky spirits are real. And in Lakota, which is the tribe of my theoretically most probable father, which is another story that I'm not going to tell you today. They're called Wakan Tonkan, which are, it means the deepest, sacredest. And so the sky spirits are referred to in that way. So, so the next fundamental assumption of indigenous psychology is that it's normal to converse with other than humans and more than humans. And so I've got a story about that. One of our colleagues, Megan Bang, who's a indigenous philosopher of science, was teaching her son to talk to plants and to listen to them and to talk to them in their native language, their indigenous language. And so his classmates, he was in first grade, and his classmates went on a field trip, and he proceeded to talk to some plants, and the teacher made fun of him. And when he came home, he refused to speak his language and to have any further conversations with plants. And so Megan went down to the school and had a talk with that teacher about what she called epistemological genocide, trying to destroy someone else's view of how the world works. And so hearing voices is normal. I didn't actually realize that everyone didn't hear voices until I got to medical school. And then I discovered you better keep quiet. They'll lock you up if you talk about this stuff. So in indigenous culture, it's normal to hear voices and to have extraordinary experiences. And as one of my one of the guys whom I do acupuncture with for his back told me, he said, "You can't talk to white people about this shit. They get all woo-woo on you." So anyway, it's normal to talk to others. And so this is where I grew up. And when you sit beside the lake, it talks to you. And you're not crazy. And you're not crazy to talk back to it. You might be neo-Indigenous. You might be going native. And when we do ceremonies, we speak to the spirits, the ancestors, and they speak back sometimes. So, and sometimes they're a noisy bunch. My grandmother won't stop talking. I get so annoyed with her sometimes. I say, "Grandmother, can't you just be quiet?" And she's like, "No, I've got to show you the right way to do things." You know? So, and some of them are a little more circumspect, but they can be a noisy bunch. And they're great company, ancestors and these other spirits. So I like my voices, you know, they're loving and kind, and they keep the mean voices, which mostly come from Homo economicus and neoliberal capitalism, as you heard, as you heard in the last lecture, mostly keep them under control. One of the Lakota elders was talking to the men while the women were taking too long in their ceremony before the lunch was going to be served, and so he got onto a riff about Homo economicus, who's the ultimate evil spirit. He said, "You thought it was Iktomi, but it's not." He said, "Them Europeans have invented someone even worse than Iktomi." I don't know, I think it was John Locke who invented Homo economicus, wasn't it? Yeah. He's also the guy that said that collective ownership of land was primitive and savage, and no one should own land if they didn't understand individual property, which was the philosophical justification for taking land away from the indigenous people in the Americas. So, that guy looks a lot like my grandfather, but I don't have a picture of my grandfather because he didn't ever want his picture taken. And I thought this was a kind of interesting. You see the Plains headdress? That's for the tourists, because nobody in Cherokee country ever wore those, ever, historically. But, you know, you do things for the tourists that you probably don't want to do. And this is where my father's ancestors come from. And this was my methodology slide. These are some of my better informants. And, you know, everyone uses constructivist grounded theory, and I'm no exception. Enough of that. And so what we're really interested in is why some people having extraordinary experiences become unwell. Because in indigenous country, it's normal to have extraordinary experiences. You know, it's kind of fun, and, you know, it's not something you really talk a lot about because it's kind of ordinary and nobody wants to hear your extraordinary experience anyway. But, you know, it's somewhat normalized. And so let's look at why some people become unwell. And I think the number one cause that the elders told me was trauma. Now, that doesn't surprise you guys. I mean, I found a study that people with trauma are 56 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. And it's a violent society that we live in. There's all kinds of genocide, epistemological, physical. I mean, people are killing each other. And we have a new nurse practitioner at Wabanaki, and she was reading through some of my notes on some of the people that she might see. And she came to me and she said, "I can't believe the amount of abuse that I'm seeing." She said, "I don't know if I can handle this." And I said, "Well, you know, our job is to create a safe space for the medicine to work. And our job is to listen without judgment or interpretation and to be present in a healing way. And that's what we do here. So we'll see how that goes. I should have turned off, I thought I turned off the sound. I want to tell you about someone whom I worked with, because stories help us understand things better than just facts. I'm doing a class next week for the Arts and Medicine seminar at University of Maine on fiction as research. And so I'm going to talk about Michelle. And Michelle came to see me and proudly announced that she'd had more than 300 psychiatric hospitalizations. And she'd attempted suicide more than 75 times. I said, it's a good thing you're not very good at it. And so she plopped herself down in the chair and she said, so what are you going to do for me? And I said, I don't know. You've seen more smart people than I've ever met. I don't know what I'm going to do for you. And she said, well, what drugs are you going to put me on? And I said, well, you've already been on all of them. You know more about psychopharmacology than I'll ever know. So you pick whatever you want, that's fine. And she said, well, let me tell you my story. And I said, okay. So that took about 10 hours, not all at the same time. And so, Michelle had a European-derived mother and a Lakota father. And it was one of those, quick night affairs. And her mother dumped her with her relatives who hated Indians. So, how about that? And it sounds like her brother was about as sadistic as they come, and she just had terrible stories to tell. And here, let me just turn off the sound. I thought I'd done that, but smartphones are smarter than all of us. You do something to them and they undo it because they think they're smarter than you are. So anyway, the trauma was just incredible, and so she just kept talking and talking and talking and talking. I just kept listening and listening and listening and listening, and finally she said, well, I'm done talking. Now what are you going to do for me? I said, I don't know. You've seen all these smart people, and what did they do for you? And she said, well, nothing. And I said, well, you've told me a lot of stories. Why don't I tell you some stories? So I started telling her stories, mostly Lakota stories, because that was her ancestry. And she hadn't really been exposed to those stories because of the way she was brought up. So I talked story to her. And I don't know, that took about a year of just telling stories. And at some point she got curious about acupuncture and we did some of that. And at some point she wanted some osteopathy and we did some of that. And we just hung out. And then at one point she said, I think I'll go to one of your groups. We had 3 groups at the time. We had the opiate using group. We had complicated minds, because they liked that term. And we had fragile minds for people who couldn't put up with complicated minds. Because in fragile minds, you could just sit and be quiet and paint for 2 hours. All the groups were 2 hours long. And but in complicated minds, we'd sometimes have duels between people. So I remember 2 women dueling over who was the most dangerous, because one of them had tried to kill her husband with a crossbow and the other one had used a sword. So it was quite a competition. It could be a little bit raucous. So anyway, she started off in fragile minds, and the first day she went, she just painted in the corner of the room. And over time, she worked her way into complicated minds, and she decided she'd go to the opiate using group anyway, because even if she didn't use opiates, because it sounded like fun. And so she did that for a while. And then at some point, she came in to see me and she said, I'm bored with being crazy. She said, I'm going to stop. I'm going to put it aside. I'm going to start eating well and exercising and taking care of myself. And I'm not going to be a normal person because you're not, she said to me, but I'm going to be, not a psychiatric person. I said, great. So she proceeded to do that. And she got really healthy. And that was, I don't know, more than 10 years ago. And she's still really healthy. And she sends me Christmas cards. And she has art exhibitions now. And she sends me invitations to her art exhibitions. And so this is getting into one of the principles of Indigenous therapy, you might say. So someone in her hometown was making a documentary, and they invited her. They wanted to interview her because her story was pretty dramatic. And they asked her, they said, so what did that character Madrona do for you? And she said, what was so interesting was that he never stopped believing that I would get better. Like she said, I tried to convince him over and over that I could never get better, and it didn't matter. He never stopped believing that I would get better. And he never argued with me. He never said that didn't happen or that couldn't have happened. He just said, oh, okay, well, we got to work with that, I guess, And I thought, wow, who knew? I didn't really know what I was doing. I was just, trying to be a human being with another human being. And I just wanted to show you some collages that she made during the course of this work. So here's one of the early ones. Came out of Fragile Minds group. And then a few months later, we've got this one. And then a few months later, we've got this one. And then we're moving into this one. And this one. And this one. I like this up here. I think that's really cool. But you can see it's a big change, isn't it, over time? Yeah. Yeah. So trauma and working with trauma. And how do you work with trauma? Well, you guys know. I mean, everyone has their own ways, but one of the ways that the elders that I visited, one of their main ways of working with trauma is to just listen without judgment or interpretation, and to tell stories like I did with Michelle, and to do ceremony. We didn't talk about that, but eventually we did ceremony with Michelle. And to be patient and to believe that people will improve and to create a community. Because we did create a community with these groups and other groups that we had in the practice. And Michelle joined those communities. And that was important too. It's interesting that the slides were perfect on my computer, but they're not on this computer. Oh, well. What are you going to do? So another reason that people get unwell, according to the elders, is kind of a modern phenomena, which is unguided spiritual exploration. And I have a story about that. And this was a young woman who had this notion that she could spiritually evolve all by herself, that she didn't need a mentor. Now, in Indian country, you wouldn't go on a spiritual journey without a guide or a mentor. And I remember I met some Weechels down in southern Arizona, and I was asking them, like, when would you give someone who came to visit you, peyote? And they said, well, they'd have to live with us for a year. Because it would take a year to learn all the stories so they could manage the visions that they might have. So we wouldn't give it to anyone for a year. But not everyone is that patient. There's this modern culture drive to push it, to get there quickly, the fast way. And so this young woman went out to South Dakota and was looking for a medicine man. Now that's a big mistake. Don't ever do that, because whoever says they're a medicine man is not. And chances are good that they're going to take advantage of young white girls, which is exactly what happened. And, because the real deal doesn't advertise. Never. And you just have to hang out in the community and be useful, and eventually someone will tell you, well, if I had a knee problem, I'd go visit Frank down the road, is how it works. But anyway, so she got abused and traumatized in her attempt to become spiritual. And she didn't stop. She kept trying, and eventually she became psychotic. And so you might say it was trauma, but it's also unguided spiritual exploration, because if the indigenous thought is that if you go off into the spiritual wilderness without a guide, without a mentor, you could run into some nasty folks. You could take a wrong turn. And really what the elders do is they hold space for this sort of work. And even, for example, when we do hamblechia, which translates as crying for a vision, so it's when we sit and fast and thirst and wait for something to come to us, hopefully not a bear. But the elders are holding vigil nearby, and they're keeping a fire going constantly, and they sneak up and check on you frequently. So don't screw up. And it's a very contained, safe space. We're not just like this young woman did, just going up on a mountain and sitting down and saying, I want to vision. We don't do that. And doing that could make you crazy. And it did. And so, so that's another way that, elders believe that people get unwell. And, they do believe that there's evil forces in the world. Well, that's obvious, or we wouldn't have the invasion of the Ukraine, and we wouldn't have, George Floyd, and there's a lot of bad stuff running around. And so their notion is that if you're not protected and if you're too open, you might run into some evil dudes, and they might, kind of take over, kind of torture you, and we had a fellow like that who we worked with, who thought he was the reincarnation of Adolf Hitler, and he should kill his parents so he could go to prison and be punished for his crimes. Well, that didn't sound good. And of course, luckily his parents knew that he had these thoughts, so we didn't have to worry about, Tarasov. But what we did with him was to try to he had these, he called them ascended masters. And we were working to say, well, I don't think ascended masters would tell people to kill other people. That doesn't make sense. Maybe they're pretending to be ascended masters, and maybe they're wearing masks, and eventually he figured out that his dog would bark at them. And he decided, well, if they were ascended masters, the dog wouldn't bark at them, as if there's bad energy in the room. And so then we moved into some narrative work, and we told, he invented a story about aliens taking over a small village, but a dog saves the world because the dog doesn't have a prefrontal cortex, which is what the aliens were using to take over people's brains. Yeah. That's why they don't learn from porcupines. I've spent $750 on dogs not learning from porcupines. Poor things. That's why you have 10 dogs in a litter. Well, anyway, the dog's name was Bertzilla. And Bertzilla saved the world because he wasn't influenced by the evil aliens. And of course, this translated into his life, and he got rid of the evil spirits, and he's doing well. And so overwhelming stress, they thought is another reason people become unwell. And I think anybody who's got any common sense probably already thought of all these things. I'm not probably telling you anything you didn't already know, but I'm just telling you what elders think in Indian country. And so severe, unrelenting poverty. Well, that's going to make you crazy, and food insecurity, and just being on the bottom end of all the social determinants of health is it's a really bad place to be. And so I'll tell you a story about and I want to just say that these things are all mixed together. I'm trying to break it down in a good constructivist grounded theory way, but in reality it's all mixed together because that's how life is. And so I'll tell you a story about someone who was a really good student, and but came from a really poor background and got a scholarship to college, and it was really stressful for her because she thought she had to be perfect because someone else was paying for her. And so she didn't sleep enough, and she tried not to eat because food costs money. And when she did eat, she ate pasta because it was cheap, those noodle cartons. And, did I say rarely slept? Because sleep is the enemy of success. And eventually, she broke down and had a psychotic episode. Well, that's not so surprising, is it? And really, the work had to do with looking at these beliefs, sort of a Ron Unger CBT approach, looking at these beliefs that she'd picked up along the way, and looking at the stories, that came with those beliefs and challenging them. Like, that's kind of nutty, things like that. And she did well. So overwhelming stress, and I've got another example of that. So we had a client who came face to face. She'd been sort of blind to her ancestry, and she discovered that she had all these ancestors that died in concentration camps during World War II. And it was a big shock to her. It really jolted her. And she decided that because they'd suffered so deeply, that she should stop eating and stop having heat. Well, I live in Maine. You can't get away with that in Maine. Landlords don't like the pipes to freeze, right? They don't probably care if you eat or not, but they don't want the pipes freezing. And so she was in danger of being evicted. And so this was a situation where we used puppets, and we said, well, pick a puppet to symbolize the idea that you shouldn't eat. You shouldn't have heat because your ancestors didn't. So she picked a big T-Rex, and I said, okay, pick a puppet that symbolizes the minority view that because they suffered, no one else should suffer. That their suffering should not be in vain. She picked a little tiny rabbit. Well, that didn't look like a good matchup. So I said, okay, you're gonna need a helper here, because we don't want you to get evicted. So pick a puppet who can do battle, for you on your behalf. And so this was during the days of Kung Fu Panda. So she picked a panda puppet, and she said, well, Kung Fu Panda wouldn't save the world without eating his noodles first. You remember that. Never fight evil on an empty stomach was his motto. So I said, well, you better take this puppet home and put it by the heater, put it by the heat switch, so he can remind you, don't turn off the heat. Because Kung Fu pandas, they get uncomfortable if it gets too cold. They want it nice and warm, and I think that's actually true, that pandas like a warm environment. So, anyway, over time, she changed her ideas, gave me back the puppet, and continued on her journey. Now, I want to tell you about something that was amazing to me, and I wrote about it in Coyote Healing, in my book Coyote Healing. So, one of the things that I used to do, I used to be a roadie for elders. So I'd go with them and carry their equipment and set it up for them, prepare the space for them to do ceremonies. And so we were up in British Columbia with an elder from North Dakota, and he was doing what's called a Uwepi ceremony, which means they tie them up. So in this ceremony, they tie up the leader. His fingers get tied together, his hands get tied together behind his back. He gets rolled up in a blanket and ropes are wrapped around it. It's pretty elaborate, and he's put in a square of prayer ties, what are called chanli pata in Indian country, which are little tissue, cloth with tobacco inside on a string, 405. And so it's pitch dark, and people are singing and drumming, and the spirits come and untie him. So when the lights go on, he's untied. Once he was even in another room, and the door was locked from the outside. That was an amazing guy named Warfield Moose. If you ever get to go see Warfield Moose, that's an experience. But anyway, so before the ceremony, we were just hanging out. It's kind of a one-stop town, not even a light. And we were in the general store, which was warm, because it was winter. And there's this guy outside in the middle of the road with a shotgun and dressed in camis, and he loads his shotgun and he goes, bang, bang. And he screams, I want to be an Indian. I want to be an Indian. And then he loads again, bang, bang. I want to be an Indian. I want to be an Indian. Well, I hid. I didn't want to get shot. But anyway, the elder just walks right up to him and he says, if you want to be an Indian, give me that there shotgun. So he did. I don't know what happened to the shotgun. and then we all came out. We brought, the guy some tobacco to offer to the elder. So Melvin looks at me and he says, you're the damn psychiatrist. Go sit in the back of the pickup truck with him. And it was cold and he was crazy. That was my conclusion. So we went off to do the ceremony. Melvin hands him a drum and he says, keep up with the rest of the boys. And he had a pretty good time for a white boy. And he did. And then Melvin said, there's a woman in our community, and her husband died, and she can't really look after herself or take care of her place or her animals. He said, how'd you like to come home with me and help out? The guy says, yeah, okay. Melvin said, well, if you do, and if you last, I'll make you an Indian. So in those days, this was before 911. In those days, we all kept a collection of driver's license because most Indians look like any other Indians to border agents. And so we sorted through our collection of driver's licenses, and we found one that was pretty close. And we said, here's your new name. And it worked because we got across the border. Couldn't do that today. But anyway, so I ran into him 4 years later in the Denver airport. And he comes up to me and says, you remember me? And I said, yeah, sure. Because that's what I always say. And then he said, I'm that crazy guy that wanted to be an Indian. And he said, and you know what? He said, now I'm an Indian. He said, I'm no longer a schizophrenic. I gave that up. So he was fluent in Lakota. He knew all the songs. I mean, he was Melvin's helper. Like, who's to say he wasn't an Indian? I wouldn't argue that. And he told me, he said, a couple more years, Melvin says I can become a drug and alcohol counselor. So, but the point is, Melvin took him home. Like, how many of you would take a schizophrenic home? Someone with the label of one would. That's cool. Ron Coleman. Anybody know Ron Coleman? Yeah, Ron would, if they could get to the Isle of Lewis, not my island, if they could get to the Isle of Lewis and they could feed the pigs, Ron would take them in. I don't really have that luxury, but this guy fulfilled a really important function. He did a good job taking care of this older woman and, splitting wood for her and all of those things that needed to be done. And the key was Melvin gave him structure, and he gave him meaning, and he gave him purpose, and he gave him community. And those are crucial for recovery. So, and then, people that are in invalidating situations, double binds, you guys all know about that, so I'm going to move quickly. I realized that I don't know what time it is, and I better start paying attention to time, or I'll talk too long. And I don't want to do that, because so far we're having fun. And so part of this indigenous approach, though, is what elders do is they cultivate relationships with spiritual beings. And they ask those spiritual beings for help. And as one of them told me, they see their job as to create a safe space for the medicine. They don't believe that they heal anyone. One of them told me, he said, never take credit, never take blame, but if they offer you money, you can take it. So they ask for help from the spiritual dimension for people who are suffering in the physical dimension. And a quick example of that, my team, we're working right now with a woman who believes that her former downstairs neighbor got a super powerful device from the CIA and is broadcasting thoughts into her brain and reading her thoughts, And so she took this woman to court, and that didn't go well, as you might imagine. And so, we thought, well, we could try a little Abilify and see if that dampens the transmission. So we did, it did, but she didn't want it because it was against her religion. And so we started teaching her songs from her culture. She was Pascata Makati, which is one of the tribes in Maine. It means hunter of the pollock. And so we started teaching her the honoring song, the Pascata Makati honoring song, which meant that I had to learn it. So I now can sing it. And when she sang that song, the transmission dampened. And so we got her to learn one more song, and that helped too. And we started doing ceremony for her every week. And we would make a fire and sing songs and offer tobacco to the fire and, ask the spirits to go protect her and block all the transmission and, be helpful to her. And that was good. I mean, it worked. It wasn't perfect, but it was helpful. And being sort of multicultural, we convinced her that this one device was a jamming device, and she took that home, and that helped too, because jamming devices are actually illegal in the United States. But it looked like a jamming device, and it only cost $26, so it wasn't too bad. So all these things are helping, and she's still a work in progress, but we're keeping her out of the hospital and we're keeping her out of court, and that's really good. So, we'll see how it goes. So the elders would say that all healing is fundamentally spiritual healing. And I don't know, that seems right to me. So other things are important though. All of these things are important. And if it's fundamentally spiritual healing, well, what we eat is a function of our relationship to the animal people, the plant people, the earth, the worm people. And we need to have a good relationship with these beings and show respect, when we harvest them, and say prayers when we partake of them, and honor the people who made them, so that's important. And, moving, if you don't move, you die. I work so hard to get people to move who aren't moving. And I tell them, sitting in your chair is not an act of cultural resistance. Doing what your ancestors did is an act of cultural resistance. Eating what they ate is a way to get back at the European invaders. Following a traditional diet and being as active as those ancestors. That's how to get back at the Europeans. I haven't convinced everyone, but I'm working on it. But finding community, and I think that's one of the things that we do at Wabanaki Public Health and Wellness is we create community. If you don't have one, we got you covered. You can come. We have a community room. You can spend the whole day there if you want. At some point we have to kick you out because we have to lock the building, according to the landlord. Probably we wouldn't ever lock it if we could get away with it, but we can't. And we find you a case manager. We get you a therapist. We if you don't show up for your appointment, we go find you, and we track you down. So we make sure that people know that they belong to us. One woman has missed or canceled her appointment, I think now 7 times with me. And the last time she texted me, she says, "Aren't you going to fire me?" And I said, "No, we're Wabanaki. You can't get rid of us. We're always here." And I think it's strangely therapeutic for her that I won't fire her. I think she's testing me, like, what can I do to get him to fire me? And I'm like, nothing. I'm here. Someday, I figure if she keeps making more appointments, it must be doing something, Because if it wasn't worth the energy, why would she text me for another appointment? So I must be doing something useful. Let's see, I bet it's getting close to the time to wrap up. Let me see if I have one more. And just in case you ever need to know this, rattling and singing paralyzes evil spirits. I want to leave you with that thought before I end my formal presentation. So everyone go out and get a rattle and learn at least one song. Even Yellow Submarine will work. So, all right. So I stand forth to receive comments, questions, answers, and other statements. Yes. Do you want to use the microphone so they can hear you? Yeah. Because the people out there can't hear you without the microphone.
Okay, so I'm just here to monitor. First of all, thank you. That was quite insightful. So the question that comes up is, would you describe a bit more about double binds?
Yeah. I think so. The worst double bind that I've seen people in is when a relative sexually abuses them and they want to report it, and the people around them tell them that it didn't happen and that making a false accusation would destroy the family. And how dare they make up this thing? And why are they upset? So that'll make you crazy. And I'm sure you can think of many more examples. It's basically being told that what happened didn't happen and you shouldn't feel that way. So, anyone else want to? I always dislike the word question because it implies that I have answers. and I worry about that. Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm sure you're doing that now, right? Yeah. Sounds good. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we need people to give us permission to be crazy and weird, because the mainstream is frightening. They're very powerful and threatening, and they have a lot of rules. And I'm lucky because I work for Indians, and so I get away with acting like an Indian, so far. The other Indian, and I think it's you just feel your way into it. Conversations like conversations with the spirit of marijuana is interesting, and looking for like intergenerational trauma, like the traumatized relatives is interesting. And there's a wonderful book by Wiramu Nia and Alistair Bush called, it's something like Cross-Cultural Indigenous Therapies. And they have some really interesting case studies of like people who have become psychotic and they repair a broken taboo and they're fine again, they're well again. And so that comes out of Maori culture. But there may be parallels in your culture, that could be explored. And it sounds like a lot of fun, yeah. Right. Very good. Yeah, we have to, I'm not opposed to medication, of course. If it keeps someone out of the hospital or out of jail, I'm really fine to prescribe it. But it's not a solution. It's just a temporizing measure. Yeah, yeah, yes. You probably need the microphone for the invisibles. Hmm. Well, all I can really say is that when I lived in California, I met some Asian practitioners who were amazing, who worked with those energies. And I don't really understand it because it's not my culture. And in North America, we don't have a concept of collective unconscious. So just a whole bunch of spirits arguing with each other, and so I don't really know how to speak to that either. But I think that Asian culture is rich in dealing with these things, and I'm brought to think about the masks that they make in Bali for healing, and the ritual dances that they do, and the protector spirits that they invoke. And I just think it's an incredibly rich culture, for getting well again. Yeah. So that's about all I know how to say about that. Yeah. I suspect that we're out of time. I see people opening the door and glaring. so thank you guys for listening. Yeah.